The dust settled on Zelda Armstrong's black mourning dress as she knelt beside the freshly turned earth, her fingers tracing the crude wooden cross that bore her husband's name with trembling reverence. 3 months had passed since consumption had stolen Thomas Armstrong from her arms, leaving her alone in this unforgiving frontier town of Green River, Wyoming, in the summer of 1878. And still the tears came as freely as the first day they had lowered his pine coffin into the ground. The wind swept across the hillside cemetery, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of rain. But Zelda noticed none of it, lost as she was in the overwhelming emptiness that had become her constant companion since the day her husband had drawn his last rattling breath. She had come to this spot every morning for weeks now, sometimes talking to the grave as if Thomas could still hear her, sometimes just sitting in silence and letting the grief wash over her in waves. Today the sorrow felt particularly heavy, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. At 24 years old, she had imagined a lifetime ahead with Thomas, children playing in the yard of their small homestead, growing old together, watching the seasons change over the Wyoming landscape. Instead, she was a widow, alone in a harsh land that showed no mercy to those without protection or means. The sound of boots crunching on the dry ground behind her made Zelda start, and she quickly wiped at her tear-stained cheeks with the back of her hand. She had not expected anyone else to be at the cemetery this early, when the morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gold and pink. Turning her head slightly, she saw a tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun, a cowboy by the look of his worn leather chaps and the wide-brimmed hat he held respectfully in his hands. "Madam," the man said, his voice low and rough like gravel, yet somehow gentle, "I do not mean to intrude on your grief. I have been seeing you here most mornings on my way into town, and today I just could not ride past without stopping." Zelda turned fully then, getting her first clear look at the stranger. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent working under the Wyoming sun. His hair was dark brown and fell just past his collar, and his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-blue that seemed to hold both kindness and a deep well of understanding. There was something about the way he stood there, hat in hand, that told her he knew what it meant to suffer loss. "You have been watching me?" Zelda asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. Her voice was hoarse from crying, barely more than a whisper. "Not watching exactly," the cowboy said, taking a cautious step closer. "Just noticing. I work at the Yates Ranch about 5 miles north of here, and I ride this way most days. My name is Yates Younger, and I reckon I should have introduced myself properly before speaking." "Zelda Armstrong," she replied automatically, then looked back at the grave. "This was my husband, Thomas. He died 3 months ago." Yates was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were careful and measured. "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Armstrong. Consumption is a cruel thief. It took my mother when I was just 16, and I watched her waste away for months before she finally found peace." Something in his tone made Zelda believe he truly understood. She had grown tired of the well-meaning but hollow condolences from the townspeople, the way they looked at her with pity before hurrying past as if widowhood might be contagious. But this stranger, this Yates Younger, spoke with the authority of someone who had walked through the valley of grief himself. "I do not know how to keep going," Zelda heard herself say, surprised by her own honesty. "Every day feels like drowning. I wake up, and for just a moment I forget he is gone, and then it all comes crashing back." Yates moved closer, close enough that she could see the weathered lines around his eyes and the old scar that ran along his left jawline. He lowered himself to sit on the ground beside her, his long legs stretched out in front of him, seemingly unbothered by the dust that would certainly mark his clothes. "Let me help you live again," he said simply, and there was no presumption in his voice, no inappropriate suggestion, just a straightforward offer from one human being to another. "I do not claim to have all the answers, Mrs. Armstrong, but I know that grief can swallow a person whole if they face it alone. I know because I nearly let it swallow me after my mother died, and then again when I lost my best friend to a range war down in Colorado." Zelda studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. "Why would you want to help a stranger?" she asked. "Because I remember what it was like to be in that dark place," Yates replied, his gray-blue eyes holding her gaze steadily. "And because I wish someone had offered me a hand when I needed it most. I am not suggesting anything improper, madam. I just thought maybe having a friend, someone who understands, might help lighten the burden a bit." The word friend resonated in Zelda's chest. She had friends in town, or at least she had thought she did, but since Thomas's death, they had all seemed to drift away, uncomfortable with her mourning or uncertain how to act around her. The isolation had been almost as painful as the loss itself. "I come here every morning," Zelda said slowly. "It is the only place I feel close to him anymore." "Then I will come here too if you would like the company," Yates offered. "Or if you would rather be alone, I will respect that. But the offer stands, Mrs. Armstrong. Grief is a heavy load, and it is easier to carry when shared." Something shifted in Zelda's chest, a tiny crack in the wall of sorrow that had encased her heart. She looked at this stranger who had stopped his morning ride to check on a grieving widow, who spoke of his own losses without shame, and she found herself nodding slowly. "I would like the company," she admitted quietly. "And please call me Zelda. Mrs. Armstrong sounds like someone I used to be." A small, sad smile touched Yates's lips. "Zelda, then, and I am just Yates. Mr. Anything makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit instead of these dusty work clothes." They sat together in silence for a while, as the sun continued its climb into the morning sky. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but rather a shared moment of peace. Two people who had known loss simply existing in the same space. When Zelda finally rose to leave, brushing the dust from her black skirts, Yates stood as well and walked with her down the hill toward the town. "Do you have family here?" Yates asked as they walked, leading his horse by the reins. "No," Zelda replied. "Thomas and I came out here from Ohio 2 years ago, hoping to make a fresh start. We wanted to build something of our own, away from the crowded cities. My parents died when I was young, and Thomas was an only child. It is just me now." "What about the homestead? Are you managing it alone?" Zelda shook her head, and fresh tears threatened to spill. "I lost it last month. Without Thomas to work the land, I could not keep up with everything. I sold what I could and moved into a boarding house in town. I'd taken sewing and mending to pay for my room and board." Yates frowned, clearly troubled by this information. "That is a hard way to make a living, especially for someone dealing with grief." "I do not have much choice," Zelda said, trying to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "This is the frontier. There is no room for weakness or self-pity. You work or you starve. Strength is not measured by how well you hide your pain," Yates said quietly. "Real strength is continuing to put one foot in front of the other, even when everything inside you wants to give up. From where I stand, you are one of the strongest people I have met." Zelda stopped walking and turned to look at him fully. No one had said anything like that to her since Thomas died. Everyone else had either avoided her or treated her like she was made of glass, liable to shatter at any moment. But Yates saw her, really saw her, and recognized the battle she fought every single day just to survive. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "You do not know how much I needed to hear that." They reached the edge of town, where the cemetery hill gave way to the dusty main street of Green River. The town was beginning to wake up, with shopkeepers opening their doors and early risers heading about their business. Zelda felt the familiar weight of curious stares and whispered conversations that seemed to follow her everywhere these days. "Will you be here tomorrow morning?" Yates asked, settling his hat back on his head. Zelda nodded. "I am always here in the mornings." "Then I will see you tomorrow, Zelda," Yates said with a slight tip of his hat. "And maybe, if you are willing, we could talk some more." Sometimes the best medicine for a wounded heart is simply being heard. As Zelda watched him swing up into his saddle and ride off toward the northern road, she felt something she had not experienced in months, a tiny spark of hope. It was fragile and tentative, barely more than a flicker in the darkness, but it was there nonetheless. For the first time since Thomas died, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. True to his word, Yates was waiting by Thomas's grave when Zelda arrived the next morning. He had brought 2 tin cups of coffee, still steaming in the cool dawn air, and offered one to her with a shy smile. They sat together on the hillside, sipping the strong brew and watching the sun rise over the Wyoming landscape in comfortable silence. "Tell me about Thomas," Yates said eventually. "What was he like?" Zelda was surprised by the question. Most people avoided mentioning Thomas, as if speaking his name might cause her more pain. But Yates seemed to understand that remembering was not the same as dwelling, that keeping Thomas's memory alive was important to her healing. "He was kind," Zelda began, her voice soft with memory. "So incredibly kind. He could never pass a stray dog without stopping to see if it needed help, and he would give away his last dollar if he thought someone needed it more than he did. He was not particularly tall or strong, but he worked harder than any man I ever knew. When he set his mind to something, nothing could stop him." "How did you meet?" Yates asked, genuinely interested. A small smile touched Zelda's lips, the first real smile she had managed in weeks. "At a church social in Ohio. I was 17 and he was 21. He was new to town, working as a clerk at the general store, and he was so nervous when he asked me to dance that he tripped over his own feet and nearly knocked over the punch bowl. Everyone laughed, but he just grinned and offered me his hand anyway. I loved that about him, the way he could laugh at himself and not take everything so seriously." "He sounds like he was a good man," Yates said sincerely. "He was the best man I have ever known," Zelda replied, and the tears came again, but this time they felt different somehow, not quite so heavy with despair. "I miss him so much it feels like I cannot breathe sometimes." Yates set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "That feeling will not disappear overnight, Zelda. Maybe it will never disappear completely, but I promise you it will get easier. The grief will not feel quite so suffocating. You will find moments where you can breathe again, and those moments will become more frequent until one day you realize you have lived an entire hour without feeling like you are drowning." "Did that happen for you, after your mother and your friend?" Zelda asked. "Eventually, yes," Yates nodded. "But it took time and I had to let myself feel everything. The sadness, the anger, the guilt. I think that is where a lot of people go wrong with grief. They try to push it away or pretend it is not there, but grief demands to be felt. It will sit on your chest until you acknowledge it." They talked for over an hour that morning, and by the time Zelda had to leave to get to her sewing work, she felt lighter than she had in months. Yates walked her back to town again, and they made plans to meet the following morning as well. This became their routine over the following weeks. Every morning, Yates would be waiting at the cemetery with coffee, and they would sit together talking about everything and nothing. Zelda told him about her childhood in Ohio, about learning to sew from her grandmother, about the dreams she and Thomas had shared for their future. Yates shared his own stories about growing up on a small ranch in Montana, about learning to break horses from his father, about the years he had spent drifting from job to job before settling at the Yates Ranch outside Green River. "Why did you stop drifting?" Zelda asked one morning in late July when the heat was already building despite the early hour. Yates was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "I got tired of running," he finally said. "After my friend died in that range war, I spent 2 years moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. I think I was afraid that if I cared about anything or anyone, I would just end up losing them too. But that is no way to live, Zelda. You cannot protect yourself from pain by refusing to feel anything at all. You just end up hollow." "What changed?" Zelda pressed gently. "I met the ranch owner, Samuel Yates," Yates explained. "I was passing through Green River, planning to move on after a few days, when I stopped in at the Silver Dollar Saloon for a drink. Samuel was there, and he got into an argument with some drifters who were causing trouble. They outnumbered him 3-1, and I could see it was about to turn ugly, so I stepped in. We ran those troublemakers out of town together, and afterward, Samuel bought me a drink and offered me a job. Said he could use a man who was not afraid to stand up for what was right. I told him I was not planning to stay, but he just laughed and said that was fine. The job would be there if I changed my mind. Something about the way he said it made me think twice about leaving. I have been working for him ever since, almost 3 years now." "He must think highly of you," Zelda observed, "to have his ranch named after him and keep you on so long." Yates grinned, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Samuel named the ranch after himself because he said he worked too hard buying the land not to put his name on it. He is a good man, though, fair and honest. He treats his workers well and pays a decent wage. I am lucky to have found him." As the weeks passed and summer deepened into the heat of August, Zelda began to notice subtle changes in herself. She still visited Thomas's grave every morning, but the visits were no longer dominated by overwhelming sorrow. Instead, she found herself talking to Thomas in her mind, telling him about Yates and the conversations they shared, about the way her heart was slowly learning to beat without quite so much pain. She thought Thomas would have approved of Yates, would have liked his straightforward honesty and genuine kindness. Yates, for his part, began to stay in town longer after their morning meetings, walking Zelda to the boarding house where she lived and sometimes accompanying her on errands. The townspeople noticed, of course, and Zelda was aware of the whispers and speculative looks that followed them. She knew what people were thinking, that it was too soon for her to be keeping company with another man, that she should still be deep in mourning. But Yates was helping her find her way back to the land of the living, and she refused to feel guilty about that. One particularly hot morning in mid-August, Yates arrived at the cemetery looking troubled. He had the coffee as usual, but his movements were distracted, and his mind seemed elsewhere. Zelda noticed immediately. "What is wrong?" she asked, accepting the coffee cup with a concerned frown. Yates sighed and settled onto the ground beside her. "Samuel got word yesterday that there is trouble with rustlers hitting ranches in the area. 3 herds have been hit in the past 2 weeks, including one of our neighbors. Samuel is worried we might be next, so he is increasing patrols and keeping extra men on watch at night." "Is it dangerous?" Zelda felt a flutter of worry in her chest, which surprised her. She had not allowed herself to care about anyone's safety in months, too wrapped up in her own grief to have emotional energy for anyone else. "It could be," Yates admitted. Rustlers are not usually looking for a fight, but if they are cornered or caught in the act, things can turn violent quickly. Samuel does not want anyone taking unnecessary risks, but we cannot just let them steal our cattle either. Those animals represent the ranch's livelihood. Zelda set down her coffee cup and reached out, placing her hand gently on Yates's arm. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact with him, and she saw his eyes widen slightly in surprise at the gesture. "Please be careful," she said earnestly. "I have already lost one person I care about. I do not think I could bear to lose another." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Yates covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "I will be careful," he promised. "I have something worth being careful for now." They looked at each other for a long moment, and Zelda felt something shift between them. What had started as friendship was deepening into something more, and while part of her felt guilty about it, another part recognized the truth. Thomas was gone and she was still alive. She could honor his memory while still allowing herself to feel again, to open her heart to the possibility of connection and perhaps even love. "Yates," she began hesitantly, "I need to tell you something." "I am listening," he said softly, his hand still covering hers. "When you first approached me here at the cemetery, I was in such a dark place. There were days when I honestly did not know if I wanted to keep going. Everything felt pointless without Thomas, but you changed that. These past weeks, talking with you every morning, having someone who understands and does not judge me for still grieving, it has made all the difference. You have helped me find reasons to keep living." Yates squeezed her hand gently. "You did the same for me, Zelda. I did not realize how lonely I had been until I met you. Oh, I have friends at the ranch and I know people in town, but I have not really connected with anyone in years. I have kept everyone at arm's length because I was afraid of caring and losing. You reminded me what it feels like to truly see another person and be seen in return." "I feel guilty sometimes," Zelda confessed, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, "for enjoying your company so much, for looking forward to seeing you every morning, for the way my heart speeds up when I hear your footsteps coming up the hill. It has only been 4 months since Thomas died. Is it wrong for me to feel these things?" "No," Yates said firmly, turning to face her fully and taking both her hands in his. "Zelda, look at me. There is no timeline for grief, no rule book that says you have to suffer for a certain amount of time before you are allowed to feel happiness again. Thomas loved you, right? He would want you to be happy. He would want you to live, not just exist." Tears streamed down Zelda's face, but they were cleansing tears, washing away months of guilt and self-recrimination. "I loved him so much," she said through her tears. "I still love him. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Yates assured her, reaching up to gently wipe the tears from her cheeks. "You can love Thomas's memory and still have room in your heart for new feelings. The heart is not a finite thing, Zelda. It expands to hold whatever we allow it to hold." Zelda leaned into his touch, drawing comfort from his presence and his words. They sat together in the morning sunlight, hands clasped, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding. An acknowledgement that what was growing between them was real and worth exploring, even if it felt impossibly complicated. The following week brought new challenges. The rustlers struck the Yates ranch, making off with nearly 24 head of cattle despite the increased patrols. Yates was part of the group that gave chase, riding out before dawn and not returning until well after dark. Zelda spent that entire day in a state of anxious worry, barely able to focus on her sewing work. When Yates finally appeared at the cemetery the next morning, exhausted but unharmed, she threw her arms around him without thinking. "Thank God," she breathed against his shoulder. I was so worried. Yates held her close, his arms coming around her waist to pull her against his chest. I am all right, he murmured into her hair. We tracked them for miles but lost the trail in the rocky country east of here. Samuel reported it to the sheriff, but I do not know if that will do much good. The law is spread pretty thin out here. Zelda pulled back just enough to look up at his face, her hands resting on his chest. You look exhausted. Did you sleep at all? A few hours, Yates admitted, but I wanted to see you this morning. I spent all of yesterday thinking about you, wondering what you were doing, hoping you were not worrying too much. I was absolutely worrying, Zelda said with a watery smile. I paced so much I probably wore a path in the boarding house floor. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who runs the place, asked me 3 times if I was feeling well. Yates smiled and lifted one hand to cup her cheek. I am sorry I worried you, but I am fine, Zelda. A little tired and a lot frustrated that we lost those rustlers, but fine. They stood there holding each other as the sun rose higher in the sky, both aware that they had crossed some invisible line. When Zelda finally stepped back, she glanced at Thomas's grave and felt a sense of peace rather than guilt. She had loved Thomas with everything she had, but he was gone and she was here, and this man standing before her was offering her a second chance at happiness. Thomas, who had been so kind and generous in life, would not want her to shut herself away from love. Yates, she said quietly, I think I am ready to start living again, really living, not just going through the motions. His gray-blue eyes brightened with hope and something deeper, warmer. What does that look like to you? I do not know exactly, Zelda admitted. But I know I want you to be part of it. These past weeks have shown me that it is possible to move forward without forgetting the past. You have been so patient with me, never pushing, always understanding. I care about you, Yates, more than I thought I was capable of caring about anyone again. Yates took her hands in his once more, his expression serious and sincere. I care about you too, Zelda, more than I can put into words. You walked into my life when I did not even realize how much I needed someone, and you changed everything. I know the situation is complicated. I know people will talk and judge, but if you are willing to try to see where this could go between us, then I am all in. People are already talking, Zelda pointed out with a small, rueful smile. I hear the whispers at the general store and see the looks at church. Half the town thinks I am being scandalous, keeping company with a man so soon after my husband's death. You care what they think? Yates asked. Zelda considered the question seriously before answering. I care less than I thought I would. Their opinions do not change what I feel or what I have been through. Only I know what I need to heal, and what I need is you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Yates pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head, and Zelda let herself relax into his embrace. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her ear, strong and alive and real. This was not a betrayal of Thomas's memory, she realized. This was her choosing to honor the life she still had to live. As summer gave way to September, and the air began to cool with the promise of autumn, Yates and Zelda's relationship deepened and evolved. They still met every morning at the cemetery, but now their conversations ranged far beyond grief and loss. They talked about their hopes for the future, about the places they wanted to see and the things they wanted to accomplish. Yates shared his dream of one day having his own small ranch. Nothing grand, but enough land to run a modest herd and maybe some horses. Zelda confessed that she had always wanted to open a dress shop, using her sewing skills to create beautiful garments instead of just doing repairs and alterations. You should do it, Yates encouraged one morning as they walked back toward town. Open a shop, I mean. You are incredibly talented, Zelda. I have seen the work you do, and it is beautiful. It takes money to start a business, Zelda said practically. Money I do not have. I can barely keep up with my boarding house rent as it is. What if you had a partner? Yates suggested carefully. Someone who believed in you and was willing to invest in your dream. Zelda stopped walking and turned to face him. Yates, I could not ask you to do that. Your money is yours, and you have your own dreams to save for. I am not offering out of pity or obligation, Yates said seriously. I am offering because I believe in you and because I want to see you succeed. Besides, maybe our dreams do not have to be separate. Maybe we could build something together. The implication in his words was clear, and Zelda felt her heart race. Together, she repeated softly, testing the word on her tongue. Are you saying what I think you are saying? Yates took her hands in his, right there on the main street of Green River with curious townspeople walking past and staring openly at them. Zelda Armstrong, I know it has not been very long since we met, and I know the circumstances are complicated. But I also know that what I feel for you is real and deep, and unlike anything I have ever experienced before. I am not asking for an answer right now because I want you to be absolutely certain. But I am telling you that I am falling in love with you, and I can see a future for us if you want the same thing. Tears pricked at Zelda's eyes, but they were tears of joy mixed with lingering sadness. I am falling in love with you too, she whispered. It terrifies me and fills me with hope all at the same time. I loved Thomas with everything I had, and I thought that part of my life was over forever. But then you came along and showed me that the heart has more capacity than I ever imagined. Yates pulled her into his arms, unconcerned with the scandalized whispers and pointed stares from the townspeople around them. We will take this as slow as you need, he promised. There is no rush, Zelda. We have time to figure everything out. But fate had other plans. The following week, the owner of Zelda's boarding house, Mrs. Henderson, approached her with troubling news. The building had been sold to a new owner who planned to turn it into a saloon, and all the current residents would need to find new accommodations within the month. I am so sorry, dear, Mrs. Henderson said, wringing her hands anxiously. I did not know he was planning to sell. If I had known, I would have warned you sooner. Zelda felt panic rising in her chest as she looked around the small room that had been her home for the past 4 months. Do you know of anywhere else I might find a room? Somewhere affordable? Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. With the railroad workers coming through town, rooms are scarce and prices have gone up considerably. I wish I had better news for you. That evening, Zelda met Yates at the small cafe on Main Street where they had started having dinner together once a week. She must have looked as distressed as she felt because Yates took one look at her face and immediately reached across the table to take her hand. What happened? He asked with concern. Zelda explained the situation with the boarding house, trying to keep her voice steady even as fresh worry gnawed at her stomach. I have some money saved, but not enough for the higher rents around town. I suppose I could look for something outside of Green River, but then I would lose my sewing customers and I do not know how I would make a living. Yates was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. I have an idea, but I want you to hear me out completely before you respond, all right? Zelda nodded, curious and slightly apprehensive. The ranch has a small cabin that sits empty most of the year, Yates began. It used to house one of the hands, but he moved into the main bunkhouse last year so he could be closer to the other men. The cabin is just sitting there unused, and I am certain Samuel would be fine with you living there in exchange for taking and sewing work for the ranch. The men always need their clothes repaired, and Samuel's wife passed away years ago, so there is no one to handle that kind of work anymore. Yates, I do not know, Zelda said hesitantly. People already talk about us. If I move to the ranch where you work, the gossip will be 10 times worse. Then marry me, Yates said simply, his gray-blue eyes intense and sincere. I know it is fast, Zelda. I know some will say it is too soon, but I also know that I love you and I want to build a life with you. Marry me, and you will have a home and protection and someone who will stand beside you no matter what. Marry me because we deserve a chance at happiness, both of us. Zelda stared at him, her mind racing. It had been only 5 months since Thomas died, barely any time at all by society's standards. But it had also been 5 months of struggling alone, of fighting through grief and loneliness, of slowly finding her way back to herself with Yates's patient help. She thought about Thomas, about the kind and generous man he had been, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would want her to be happy. He would want her to be cared for and loved. Yes, she heard herself say, and then louder with more conviction. Yes, Yates, I will marry you. The smile that broke across Yates's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped over, then came around the table to pull her into his arms. The other diners in the cafe stared and whispered, but neither Yates nor Zelda paid them any attention. They were too caught up in each other, in the wonder of having found love again when both had thought themselves destined to walk alone. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Green River. The turnout was modest, with Samuel Yates and a handful of ranch hands standing as witnesses. Some of the townspeople attended out of curiosity or to show support, while others stayed away in silent disapproval. Zelda wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, knowing that wearing white would invite even more censure given the short time since Thomas's death. But as she stood before the minister and looked into Yates's eyes, speaking the vows that would bind them together, she felt nothing but rightness. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her gently, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. Zelda kissed him back and felt the last chains of grief and guilt fall away. She would always carry Thomas in her heart, would always remember the love they shared, but she was ready now to step fully into this new chapter of her life. They moved into the small cabin on the ranch that very day, and Zelda immediately set about making it into a home. It was rustic and simple, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen area, but it was clean and sturdy with a good fireplace for heat. Yates helped her arrange the few pieces of furniture she had managed to salvage from the homestead, and together they hung curtains and unpacked her sewing supplies. "It is perfect," Zelda said that evening as they sat together on the front porch watching the sun set over the Wyoming landscape. "I never thought I would feel at home anywhere again after losing Thomas and the homestead, but this feels right." Yates wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against his side. "This is just the beginning, Zelda. We are going to build a good life here, I promise you that." The first few months of marriage were an adjustment as they learned each other's rhythms and habits. Yates rose before dawn to start his work on the ranch, often not returning until after dark during the busy fall season when they were moving cattle and preparing for winter. Zelda established herself as the ranch seamstress, taking in mending and alterations not just from the hands but from people in town who heard about her skill. Her sewing income combined with Yates's wages gave them a comfortable living, and they began to save money toward their future goals. They still visited Thomas's grave together once a week, usually on Sunday mornings before church. Yates never seemed uncomfortable or jealous of these visits, understanding that Zelda needed to maintain that connection to her past. Sometimes she would talk to Thomas silently, telling him about her new life and asking for his blessing, and she always felt a sense of peace afterward. Winter came early and hard that year, with snow beginning to fall in mid-November and not letting up until late March. The cabin that had seemed cozy in autumn became their sanctuary as temperatures dropped, and the wind howled across the plains. Yates spent long hours checking on cattle and breaking ice in water troughs, coming home each night exhausted and half frozen. Zelda would have hot soup waiting and a warm fire burning, and they would sit close together in the evenings, sharing stories and dreams while the storm raged outside. It was during one of these quiet winter evenings, in February of 1879, that Zelda realized her monthly courses were late. She said nothing to Yates at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed, but as the days turned into weeks and certain symptoms became unmistakable, she knew she could not keep the secret much longer. "Yates," she said one evening as they prepared for bed, "I need to tell you something." He turned from where he was banking the fire for the night, his expression immediately concerned. "What is wrong? Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling wonderful, actually," Zelda said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Yates, I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Yates simply stared at her, his mouth slightly open in shock. Then a grin spread across his face, wider than any smile she had ever seen from him, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides to sweep her up in his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice choked with emotion. "Zelda, are you certain as I can be without seeing a doctor?" she confirmed, laughing at his enthusiasm. "I am about 2 months along, I think. The baby should come sometime in early September." Yates set her down carefully as if she might break, then immediately dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one," he said softly. "This is your father speaking. I cannot wait to meet you." Tears streamed down Zelda's face as she ran her fingers through his hair. This moment, this perfect, beautiful moment, was something she had never thought she would experience again. After Thomas died, she had buried all her dreams of motherhood along with him. But here she was, married to a good man who loved her deeply, carrying new life within her body. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into summer. Zelda continued her sewing work as long as she was able, though she had to adjust her schedule as her body changed and tired more easily. Yates became almost comically overprotective, constantly worrying about her lifting anything heavy or working too hard. Samuel Yates, the ranch owner, was delighted by the news and immediately began construction on an addition to the cabin, giving them a proper bedroom so the baby could have a room of its own. "You do not have to do this," Yates protested when Samuel presented the plans. "We can manage with what we have." "Nonsense," Samuel said gruffly. He was a big man in his late 50s with silver hair and a weathered face that crinkled when he smiled. "You are like a son to me, Yates, and that makes Zelda family too. Family takes care of family. Besides, I am an old man with no children of my own. Let me spoil this baby a little bit." The addition was completed by mid-August, and Zelda spent happy hours setting up the nursery with blankets and clothes she had sewn during her pregnancy. Yates carved a beautiful cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and polishing it until it gleamed. Everything was ready and waiting when Zelda went into labor on a hot September morning. The birth was long and difficult, lasting almost 20 hours. Yates paced outside the cabin door while the doctor and a midwife from town attended to Zelda inside. He could hear her cries of pain and felt utterly helpless, unable to do anything but wait and pray that both mother and baby would be all right. When the sun was setting and he heard the thin wail of an infant, He nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife emerged a few minutes later with a tired but triumphant smile. "You have a son, Mr. Younger. A big, healthy boy with a good, strong set of lungs. Mother and baby are both doing well." Yates rushed inside to find Zelda propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but glowing with joy as she held a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up when he entered, and the love in her eyes took his breath away. "Meet your son," she said softly, adjusting the blanket so he could see the baby's face. Yates approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny person cradled in his wife's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face that was somehow the most beautiful thing Yates had ever seen. As he watched, the baby yawned and opened his eyes, revealing dark blue irises that would probably lighten as he grew. "He is perfect," Yates breathed, reaching out to gently touch the baby's impossibly small hand. Tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength, and Yates felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "What should we name him?" Zelda was quiet for a moment, looking down at her son with an expression of wonder. "I would like to name him Thomas," she said softly, "after my first husband, if that is all right with you." Yates felt a lump form in his throat. Many men might have balked at naming a child after their wife's deceased husband, might have seen it as an insult or a suggestion that the new marriage was somehow less important. But Yates understood what Zelda was really asking. She wanted to honor the man who had loved her first, to ensure that Thomas Armstrong's memory lived on in a tangible way. "Thomas Younger," Yates said, testing the name. "I think it is perfect, Zelda. And I think your first husband would be honored to know that you loved him enough to carry his name forward." Zelda's eyes filled with grateful tears. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for being the kind of man who does not see my past as a threat." "Your past made you who you are," Yates said simply, sitting on the edge of the bed and putting his arm around both his wife and his son. "I would never want to erase that. Thomas Armstrong helped shape the woman I love. I only wish I could have known him." They sat together in the gathering dusk, a new family born from loss and pain, but strengthened by love and understanding. Little Thomas slept peacefully in his mother's arms, blissfully unaware of the complex emotions surrounding his birth, knowing only that he was warm and safe and loved. The first year of Thomas's life was filled with the usual challenges and joys of new parenthood. Sleepless nights were balanced by the wonder of watching their son grow and change, each new milestone a cause for celebration. Thomas was a good baby, generally happy and healthy, though he inherited his father's stubbornness and his mother's tendency to fuss when things were not exactly to his liking. Yates proved to be a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son. He would come in from long days on the ranch and immediately go to the baby, picking him up and talking to him in a soft voice about everything and nothing. Zelda would watch them together, her husband and her son, and feel her heart overflow with gratitude for this second chance at happiness. Samuel Yates doted on young Thomas as well, frequently stopping by the cabin with gifts and treats. "Spoiling him rotten," Yates would grumble good-naturedly, but Zelda could see how pleased he was that his son had such a devoted grandfather figure. As Thomas approached his first birthday, Yates and Zelda began to discuss their long-term plans. They had been saving diligently, and between Zelda's sewing income and Yates's wages, they had accumulated a modest nest egg. Samuel, who was getting older and thinking about slowing down, had approached Yates with an interesting proposition. "I want to sell you part of the ranch," Samuel said one evening when he had been invited for dinner. "Nothing huge, maybe 200 acres on the eastern section. You have been a loyal worker and a good friend, Yates, and I trust you. I would rather see the land go to someone I know will take care of it properly than sell to strangers." Yates and Zelda exchanged excited glances. "We have been saving," Yates said carefully, "but I do not know if we have enough for 200 acres. "We can work out terms," Samuel said with a wave of his hand. "Payment over time, interest-free. I am not looking to get rich off you, son. I am looking to secure the future of this ranch and ensure that when I am gone, it is in good hands." It took several months to work out all the details and secure the legal papers, but by the spring of 1880, Yates and Zelda officially owned 200 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land. It was not the massive spread that some ranchers controlled, but it was theirs, and it represented the fulfillment of dreams they had both carried for years. They began building a proper house that summer, a sturdy structure with 4 rooms and a real kitchen. Zelda planned space for a sewing room where she could expand her dressmaking business, while Yates designed a barn for the small herd of cattle they planned to build. The work was hard and progress was slow, but they tackled it together, with help from the ranch hands and Samuel. Young Thomas took his first steps just as the frame of the house was going up, toddling across the dusty yard toward his father with his arms outstretched and a huge grin on his face. Yates scooped him up and spun him around, both of them laughing with pure joy. Zelda captured the moment in her memory, knowing she would treasure it always. They moved into the new house in November, just before Thomas's 2nd birthday. It was not completely finished, with many of the interior walls still needing paint and some of the fixtures not yet installed, but it was weathertight and warm. Zelda stood in the middle of their new living room on that first night, holding Thomas on her hip while Yates built a fire in the fireplace, and felt overwhelming gratitude for everything they had built together. "I keep thinking about that morning you found me at the cemetery," she said softly. "I was so lost, so certain my life was over, and now look at us. We have a home and land and this beautiful boy. We have a future, Yates, a real future." Yates came to stand beside her, wrapping his arms around both his wife and his son. "We built it together," he said. "Every piece of happiness, every accomplishment, we did it as a team. I am so proud of us, Zelda, so proud of you." "I could not have done any of this without you," Zelda said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You helped me find myself again when I thought I was lost forever. You gave me a reason to keep going." "You did the same for me," Yates reminded her. "I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions but never really living. You showed me what it means to truly connect with another person. You taught me that it is possible to survive loss and come out stronger on the other side." Thomas, caught between his parents, squirmed and giggled, patting both their faces with his chubby hands. They laughed and each kissed one of his cheeks, then stood together in their new home, a family united by love and strengthened by the trials they had overcome. The years that followed were good ones, filled with hard work and steady progress. Their herd grew from 20 head to over 100, as they carefully managed their grazing land and made smart purchases. Zelda's dressmaking business flourished, with women coming from as far as Laramie to commission gowns for special occasions. She hired 2 young women from town as apprentices, teaching them the skills her grandmother had taught her and providing them with respectable employment. Young Thomas grew into a bright, energetic child who loved following his father around the ranch and helping with any task he was old enough to handle. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray-blue eyes, and a personality that was equal parts stubborn determination and genuine kindness. At night, Zelda would tell him stories about both his namesake and the man who raised him, wanting him to understand the complexity of his heritage. "You carry the name of a good man who loved your mother very much," Yates would add. "Thomas Armstrong would be proud of the boy you are becoming. And I am proud to be your father and to watch you grow." In the spring of 1883, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. She was 29 now, and Thomas was almost 4, and while part of her worried about the risks of another pregnancy, she was also excited to expand their family. Yates was overjoyed at the news, though this time he was somehow even more protective than he had been the first time around. "I know what I am doing now," Zelda laughed when he tried to carry a small basket of laundry for her. "I am not fragile, Yates. I am pregnant, not made of glass." "I just want to take care of you," he protested, looking slightly sheepish. "Both of you. This pregnancy was easier than the first, with less sickness and more energy." Zelda continued working almost until the day she went into labor in early December, delivering a healthy baby girl with a full head of blonde hair and her father's strong features. They named her Grace, and she was as different from Thomas as night from day, quiet and contemplative where he had been loud and active as an infant. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help take care of her. Zelda and Yates would watch their 2 children together, heads bent over Grace's cradle, and marvel at how their lives had transformed in just 5 years. Samuel Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1884, leaving the remainder of his ranch property to Yates with the stipulation that it remain working rangeland and not be sold to speculators. It was a bittersweet moment, gaining the land they had always dreamed of, but losing the man who had become like a father to Yates and a beloved grandfather to their children. They held a proper funeral in town, with nearly everyone in Green River attending to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of the community. Zelda stood beside her husband as they lowered Samuel's coffin into the ground, and she thought about that morning so many years ago when Yates had found her weeping over Thomas Armstrong's grave. Life moved in strange circles, bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure, but the key was having someone to share both the good times and the bad. With the expanded property, their ranch became one of the more successful operations in the area. Yates hired additional hands and began breeding horses as well as cattle, developing a reputation for quality stock. Zelda's dressmaking business continued to thrive, and she eventually opened a small shop in town, traveling in 3 days a week to meet with clients and oversee her apprentices. As the years passed, and Wyoming moved from wild frontier to more settled territory, Yates and Zelda watched their children grow and their prosperity increase. Thomas Armstrong Younger grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, but with his mother's quick mind and artistic sensibility. He could work cattle with the best of them, but also had a talent for sketching, filling notebooks with detailed drawings of ranch life and the Wyoming landscape. Grace Younger was quieter but no less capable, showing an early aptitude for numbers and business that impressed both her parents. By the time she was 10, she was helping Zelda keep the books for both the ranch and the dress shop, her neat handwriting filling ledgers with precise calculations. In 1890, when Thomas was 11 and Grace was 7, Zelda discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She was 36 now, older than she had been with the previous pregnancies, and both she and Yates approached this unexpected blessing with equal parts excitement and concern. But the pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in early summer of 1891, they welcomed twin boys into the family. 2 more, Yates said in wonder, holding both babies carefully, one in each arm. "Zelda, we have 4 children. 4. "We certainly do," Zelda agreed, exhausted but happy. They named the twins Samuel and James, and the house that had seemed so spacious when they first built, it suddenly felt much smaller with 6 people living under one roof. The twins brought new energy and chaos to the family, but also tremendous joy. Thomas and Grace were old enough to help significantly with their younger brothers, and the whole family worked together to manage the increased demands on time and attention. There were challenging moments, certainly, days when Zelda wondered how she would manage everything. But there were also beautiful moments of connection and love that made all the difficulties worthwhile. One evening in the fall of 1893, after the children were all in bed, Yates and Zelda sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over land that belonged to them. Zelda was 40 years old now, with strands of silver beginning to show in her dark hair, and Yates was approaching 50, his face more lined than it had been when they first met but still handsome in her eyes. "You ever think about where you would be if we had never met?" Zelda asked, her hand resting comfortably in his. Yates considered the question seriously before answering. "Probably still working for someone else's ranch, coming home to an empty cabin every night. I would have survived, but I would not have truly lived. What about you?" "I honestly do not know if I would have survived," Zelda admitted quietly. "That morning you found me at the cemetery, I was in such a dark place. I had no hope, no reason to keep going. You saved my life, Yates. Not just by offering friendship, but by showing me that it was possible to heal and move forward without betraying the past." "We saved each other," Yates corrected gently, lifting her hand to kiss her knuckles. "You gave me a reason to stop running from connection and commitment. You taught me that love does not have to end in loss, and that sometimes taking the risk of caring is worth whatever pain might come." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of evening settling over the ranch. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and closer by, horses moved peacefully in their corral. Inside the house, their 4 children slept safely in their beds, probably dreaming of the adventures tomorrow would bring. "I still visit Thomas's grave sometimes," Zelda said. "I hope that does not bother you." "Of course not," Yates assured her. "He was your husband and you loved him. That love does not diminish what we have together, Zelda. If anything, it makes what we share more meaningful because you chose to open your heart again even after losing him." "I think Thomas would have liked you," Zelda mused. "You are both good men, though in different ways. Thomas was gentle and kind, always seeing the best in people. You are strong and steady, someone who can be depended on no matter what. Our son is lucky to carry both legacies." Yates pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We have built something good here, Zelda. A family, a home, a life. When I think about that cowboy who was too afraid to care about anything or anyone, riding past a crying widow and almost not stopping, I am so grateful I found the courage to approach you that morning." "Let me help you live again," Zelda quoted softly, remembering those first words he had spoken to her. "You kept that promise, Yates. You helped me find my way back to life, and then you walked beside me every step of the way as we built this beautiful future together." They remained on the porch long into the evening, 2 people who had found each other in the aftermath of loss and created something enduring and true. The stars came out one by one over the Wyoming sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Inside, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. As the years continued to pass, Yates and Zelda watched their children grow into capable, caring adults. Thomas Jr. eventually took over primary management of the ranch, working alongside his aging father to continue building the legacy they had established. He married a schoolteacher from town, and they gave Yates and Zelda their first grandchildren, twin girls who inherited the family's determination and spirit. Grace surprised everyone by going to Teachers College in Laramie, becoming one of the first women from Green River to pursue higher education. She returned home with grand plans to improve the local school system, and she threw herself into that work with passion and dedication. She eventually married a lawyer from Cheyenne, and together they split their time between the city and the ranch, their children learning to be comfortable in both worlds. The twins, Samuel and James, were inseparable as children and remained close as adults. They developed a horse breeding program that became renowned throughout Wyoming and beyond, producing quality animals that were sought after by ranchers and the military alike. Neither of them married young, both claiming they were too busy with their work, but Zelda suspected they would eventually find partners who could match their energy and enthusiasm. In 1905, when Zelda was 51 and Yates was 62, they celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary with a large gathering that included their 4 children, their growing number of grandchildren, and friends from all over Wyoming. The ranch house had been expanded twice over the years to accommodate family gatherings, and on this particular evening, it was filled with laughter and music, and the warmth of people who genuinely cared for one another. As Zelda looked around at all the faces, young and old, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. From that morning of deepest despair, when she had been crying over Thomas Armstrong's grave, unable to see any path forward, she had somehow found her way to this moment of complete joy. It had not been easy. There had been difficult days and challenging times, moments when she doubted herself and worried about the future. But through it all, Yates had been beside her, steady and strong and endlessly supportive. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, coming to stand beside her with 2 glasses of punch. "How far we have come," Zelda replied, accepting the glass with a smile. "How much life we have lived together. Do you remember being young?" Yates laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Vaguely. These days, I am reminded of my age every morning when I try to get out of bed and my knees protest. But I would not trade these years for anything, Zelda. Every gray hair and creaky joint is worth it for the life we have built." "I love you," Zelda said simply, the words as true today as they had been when she first spoke them all those years ago. "I love Thomas, and I always will carry him in my heart. But you are the love of my life, Yates Younger. You are the man who showed me that it is possible to survive grief and find joy again. You gave me a family and a home and a future when I thought all of those things were lost to me forever." Yates set down his glass and took both her hands in his, looking into her eyes with an expression of deep tenderness. "You are my everything, Zelda. My wife, my partner, my best friend. I cannot imagine my life without you in it. When I think about that lonely cowboy I used to be, drifting from place to place and never letting anyone get too close, I barely recognize him. You changed everything for me." They kissed then, surrounded by their family and friends, and it felt just as meaningful as their first kiss had been all those years ago. Love, Zelda had learned, was not a finite resource that could be used up or depleted. Instead, it grew and evolved and deepened over time, taking on new dimensions while retaining its essential core. The party continued late into the night, with the younger children eventually falling asleep in various corners while the adults talked and reminisced. Yates and Zelda circulated among their guests, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink, accepting congratulations and good wishes with genuine appreciation. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Thomas Jr. approached his parents with a serious expression. "Father, Mother, I have something to ask you. Sarah and I have been talking, and we would like to build a house on the eastern section of the property, near where the creek bends. We want to raise our girls close to family, and it would make running the ranch easier if I was living on the land." Yates looked at Zelda and she nodded her approval. "Of course, son," Yates said, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "That land is yours by right. We always intended for you to inherit the ranch eventually. You might as well start building your own legacy now." Thomas's relief was visible. "Thank you both. We will start planning the house next spring. And Father, I promise I will honor everything you have taught me about caring for the land and the animals. I know how hard you worked to build all this." "I know you will," Yates assured him. "You are a good man, Thomas Armstrong Younger. Both your namesake and I are proud of the person you have become." After everyone had left and the house was finally quiet, Yates and Zelda cleaned up the remaining mess together, working in the comfortable synchronization that came from decades of partnership. When they finally climbed into bed, both exhausted but happy, Zelda curled against Yates's side with a contented sigh. "Thank you for tonight," she murmured, "for all of this, for giving me a life worth living." "Thank you for letting me love you," Yates replied, kissing the top of her head. "For taking a chance on a broken-down cowboy who did not know what he was missing until he met you." They fell asleep in each other's arms, two people who had found their way through grief and loss to build something beautiful and lasting. The final years of their lives together were peaceful ones, marked by the quiet satisfaction of watching their legacy continue through their children and grandchildren. Yates eventually retired from active ranch work, handing over full control to Thomas Jr. while remaining available for advice and consultation. He spent his days tending a large garden, working with the younger horses, and playing with his ever-growing brood of grandchildren. Zelda continued her dressmaking business well into her 60s, though she eventually transitioned to teaching rather than doing all the work herself. She had trained dozens of young women over the years, and several of them opened their own shops in nearby towns, spreading her influence throughout the region. She took particular pride in knowing she had helped create opportunities for women to support themselves through skilled labor. On a warm morning in June of 1912, Zelda woke early and slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Yates, who was still sleeping soundly. At 58 years old, she was still healthy and active, though she moved with less speed than she once had. She made coffee in the kitchen, then walked outside to watch the sunrise over the ranch that had been her home for more than 3 decades. The air was fresh and clean, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. In the distance, she could see the house that Thomas and Sarah had built, smoke already rising from the chimney as her daughter-in-law prepared breakfast for their family. Closer by, in the barn, she could hear the twins working with the horses, their voices calling back and forth as they went about their morning routines. Zelda found herself thinking about Thomas Armstrong, her first husband who had been gone now for 34 years. She still visited his grave occasionally, though not with the regularity of her youth. The pain of his loss had long since softened into bittersweet memory, and she could think of him now with more happiness than sorrow. He had been a good man who had loved her well, and she honored his memory by living fully and loving deeply. "You would be proud of our son," she said softly, speaking to Thomas as if he could hear her across the years and the veil between life and death. "He grew up strong and kind with the best parts of both the men who shaped him, and you would like Yates, I think. He took care of me when I thought I was beyond saving. He gave me a second chance at happiness. Talking to yourself." Yates's voice came from behind her, warm with affection. Zelda turned to find her husband standing in the doorway, his hair completely white now but his gray-blue eyes still as sharp and kind as they had been the day they met. "Talking to Thomas," she corrected, "telling him about our family." Yates came to stand beside her, wrapping his arm around her waist. "I am sure he is glad to know you are happy. Any man who truly loved you would want nothing less." They stood together in the growing light, watching their world come to life around them. This was what love looked like, Zelda thought. Not just the passionate intensity of new romance, though they had certainly experienced that. Not just the raising of children and the building of a home, though those things were important too. Real love was this: standing beside someone through all the seasons of life, supporting each other through joy and sorrow, growing and changing together while remaining committed to the partnership. "You have any regrets?" Zelda asked, turning to look up at her husband. Yates considered the question carefully before answering. "Only one. I wish I had found the courage to speak to you sooner that morning at the cemetery. I rode past you for several days before I finally stopped, and I think about all the extra suffering you endured in that time. If I could change anything, it would be that. I would have stopped the very first day I saw you crying." "But you did stop," Zelda reminded him gently. "That is what matters. You saw someone in pain and you chose to help, even though it would have been easier to ride on past. You offered me your friendship and eventually your love, and you changed the entire trajectory of my life. I will be forever grateful for that, Yates." "I am the grateful one," Yates insisted, pulling her closer. "You taught me how to truly live, Zelda. Before you, I was just going through the motions, protecting myself from feeling too much. You showed me that vulnerability is not weakness, and that opening your heart to love is worth the risk of potential pain." They returned to the house together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever this new day would bring. Their lives had been full of both expected joys and unexpected challenges, but they had navigated all of it together, always coming back to the fundamental truth of their partnership. They were better together than either could have been apart. As the years continued to accumulate, Yates and Zelda remained active in their community and devoted to their growing family. They celebrated births and marriages, mourned deaths and disappointments, and through it all maintained the deep connection that had first formed on that hillside cemetery in the summer of 1878. In 1918, as the world reeled from the devastation of the Great War and the horror of the influenza pandemic, Yates and Zelda gathered their entire family at the ranch for a celebration of their 40th wedding anniversary. All 4 of their children were there, along with their spouses, and an impressive collection of grandchildren ranging from infants to young adults. Even a few great-grandchildren had appeared in recent years, continuing the legacy they had begun. The gathering was bittersweet, as several members of the community had been lost to the flu, and young men from Green River had died in the trenches of France. But it was also a celebration of survival and perseverance, a recognition that life continued even in the face of tremendous loss. 40 years, Zelda marveled as she and Yates stood before their assembled family. At 64, her hair was completely white and her face was lined with age, but her dark eyes still sparkled with intelligence and warmth. "When I think about that broken young widow crying over her husband's grave, I can barely believe she and I are the same person." "You are still that same person," Yates corrected gently. He was 75 now, moving more slowly than he once had but still sharp in mind and spirit. "You just grew and evolved. The pain you experienced did not diminish you, Zelda. It taught you compassion and strength." "We have been truly blessed," Zelda said, looking around at all the faces watching them. "Not because our lives have been easy, because they have not, but because we have had each other and this wonderful family, because we chose to build something good from the ashes of loss." Thomas Jr. stood and raised his glass. "To our parents, who showed us what real love and commitment look like." who taught us that family is not just about blood, but about choosing to stand beside each other through every storm. May we all be fortunate enough to build partnerships as strong as theirs. The toast was echoed by everyone present, glasses clinking and voices rising in celebration. Yates and Zelda held hands and smiled at each other, two people who had somehow managed to create this beautiful, complicated, wonderful legacy. As evening fell and the party began to wind down, Grace approached her parents with a thoughtful expression. "Mother, Father, I have been working on something for you, a gift to commemorate your anniversary." She handed them a leather-bound book, and when Zelda opened it, she gasped. Inside were carefully preserved photographs and documents chronicling their life together. There were pictures of their wedding, of the small cabin where they had first lived, of each of their children at various ages. There were newspaper clippings about the ranch's success and Zelda's dressmaking business. There were letters they had written to each other during the few times they had been separated, and even a dried flower from Zelda's bridal bouquet. "Grace, this is incredible," Zelda breathed, tears streaming down her face as she carefully turned the pages. "How did you collect all of this?" "I have been working on it for years," Grace admitted. "Gathering pieces from everyone in the family, conducting interviews, preserving memories. I wanted to make sure your story was not lost, that future generations would know where they came from and what you both sacrificed and built." Yates wrapped his arm around Grace's shoulders, his own eyes damp with emotion. "Thank you, daughter. This means more than you can possibly know." That night, after everyone had either left or settled into guest rooms around the house, Yates and Zelda sat up late looking through the book Grace had created. Each page brought back memories, some joyful and others painful, but all of them precious. "Look at us," Yates said, pointing to their wedding photograph. "We were so young. Well, you were young, I was already getting old." Zelda laughed and swatted his arm playfully. "You were only 47, hardly ancient, and look how handsome you were. You still are, for that matter." They continued through the book, pausing on a photograph of Thomas Jr. as a baby, then Grace as a toddler, then the twins at various ages. There were pictures of the ranch in its early days when they had just a few dozen cattle, and more recent photographs showing the sprawling operation it had become. Near the back of the book, Grace had included a photograph of Thomas Armstrong's grave marker. Zelda touched it gently, her fingers tracing the outline of the headstone through the paper. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, "something I have never really put into words before." "I am listening," Yates encouraged, setting the book aside to give her his full attention. "When you first approached me that morning at Thomas's grave, when you offered to help me live again, I honestly did not believe it was possible. I thought I was broken beyond repair, that the best parts of me had died with Thomas. But you saw something in me that I could not see in myself. You saw strength and resilience and the potential for healing, and you were patient enough to wait while I found my way back to those qualities." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I want you to know is that loving you has never felt like a betrayal of Thomas. It has felt like honoring the love he and I shared by refusing to let that love die with him. By opening my heart to you, by building this family and this life, I kept Thomas's memory alive in a way that would have made him happy. You gave me that gift, Yates. The gift of being able to love again without guilt." Yates took both her hands in his, holding them carefully as if they were something precious. "Zelda Armstrong Younger, you have been the light of my life for 40 years. You took a lonely, guarded cowboy and taught him what it means to truly share a life with another person. You gave me children and grandchildren and a legacy that will outlive both of us. But more than any of that, you gave me yourself, and that has been the greatest gift I could ever receive." They held each other close, two elderly people whose bodies showed the wear of decades but whose love remained as strong as ever. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. The world kept turning. Life kept flowing forward, but in this moment, Yates and Zelda were complete. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1920, just a few months after his 77th birthday. He had been slowing down for some time, his body finally giving in to the wear of decades of hard physical labor and the simple passage of time. But his mind had remained sharp until the end, and his last words to Zelda were ones of love and gratitude. Zelda grieved for him deeply, but it was a different kind of grief than what she had experienced with Thomas. This time, she was not a young widow left alone and uncertain in a harsh world. She was an older woman surrounded by family and strengthened by decades of love and shared experience. She mourned her partner, her best friend, the man who had helped her find her way back to life. But she also celebrated the incredible gift of their 42 years together. At the funeral, which was attended by seemingly half of Wyoming, Thomas Jr. gave the eulogy. "My father, Yates Younger, was the finest man I have ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He taught me how to work hard, how to treat people with respect, and how to love completely. He took me in as his son even though I carried another man's name, and he never once made me feel like I was anything less than his own. For that gift, and for the example he set for all of us, I will be forever grateful." After the funeral, as family and friends gathered at the ranch house for a meal, Grace pulled her mother aside for a private conversation. "How are you really doing, Mother?" she asked with concern. Zelda considered the question carefully. "I am sad," she admitted. "Your father was the love of my life, and I will miss him every single day for whatever time I have left. But I am also at peace, Grace. We had 42 wonderful years together. We built this family and this ranch. We loved each other well and raised good children. That is more than most people ever get. Do you think you will be all right here by yourself?" Grace pressed. "Thomas and Sarah have room if you want to move in with them, or you could come stay with Samuel and James. You do not have to be alone." "I appreciate the offers," Zelda said warmly, "but I want to stay in my own home for as long as I am able. This house holds 40 years of memories, Grace. Your father and I built it together. I can still feel him here in every room, in every board and nail. I am not ready to leave that behind yet." And so Zelda remained in the house on the ranch, visited frequently by her children and grandchildren, but maintaining her independence as long as possible. She continued her sewing, though now she worked more for pleasure than necessity. She tended her garden and took long walks around the property, remembering. One warm morning in June of 1922, Zelda made her way to the cemetery on the hill above Green River. She moved slowly now, leaning on a cane, but she was determined to make this journey. It had been 2 years since Yates's death, and 44 years since the morning he had first approached her here. She stood first before Yates's grave, which had been placed beside the plot she had purchased for herself. "Hello, my love," she said softly, reaching out to touch the marble headstone. "I miss you more than words can express, but I am all right. The children are doing well, the ranch is thriving, and you have more great-grandchildren than you could probably keep track of. You would be proud of the legacy we built together." Then she walked a short distance to where Thomas Armstrong's grave still stood, the wooden marker long since replaced by a proper stone. "Hello, Thomas," she said, lowering herself carefully to sit on the grass. "It has been many years since we last talked, but I wanted you to know that I kept my promise. I lived the life we dreamed of, just with someone else beside me. I hope you do not mind. I like to think you sent Yates to me that morning, that somehow you were watching over me and knew what I needed." She sat between the two graves, the two great loves of her life, and felt a profound sense of completion. Her life had been marked by loss and pain, but also by incredible love and joy. She had survived the unimaginable, rebuilt her life from ashes, and created something beautiful and lasting. Zelda Armstrong Younger passed away peacefully in her sleep in the autumn of 1924, 3 weeks after her 70th birthday. She was buried between Thomas Armstrong and Yates Younger, two men who had loved her deeply and whom she had loved in return. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember her, sharing stories of her strength and kindness, her talent and determination, her capacity for love even after experiencing devastating loss. The ranch she and Yates had built continued to thrive under Thomas Jr.'s management, eventually being passed down to his children and then to theirs. The dress shop she had founded evolved over the decades, but remained in operation well into the 20th century, a testament to her skill and vision. Her story became part of the family legacy, told and retold to each new generation. And on a hill above Green River, Wyoming, 3 graves stood together beneath the endless prairie sky. The wooden crosses had long since been replaced by marble markers, but the names remained. Thomas Armstrong, who had loved first; Yates Younger, who had helped her live again; and Zelda Armstrong Younger, who had survived grief to build a legacy of love that would endure long after she was gone. 3 lives intertwined by fate and choice, connected by love that transcended even death itself. Their story a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its infinite capacity for hope, healing, and enduring love.